Hello everybody, welcome to another upload. Today it is the 8th of March and today's video is absolutely crazy. As you can see by the thumbnail, Russian forces were able to infiltrate deep into the Ukrainian rear in the Kursk region near Sudzha through a gas pipeline that had been used up until the beginning of 2025. So we're going to look at the course of that clash in the way in which it influences the front line and more so the entire dynamic in Kursk over the past couple of days, including Ukrainian troop rotations and the entirety of the Ukrainian order of battle, including my estimate for how many Ukrainian soldiers are actually operating along this part of the front line. And so we're going to begin by looking at the yellow polygons indicating Russian advances over the past 24 hours. I'm going to, of course, begin with the pipeline story, but that's not the entire story because there are also Russian advances occurring in nearby locations in the Kursk region. But let's begin by zooming in on this pipeline, which is referred to as the Urengoy Pomari Uzhhorod pipeline, well known because it's been used for years as a conduit between Russia, then Ukraine, and all the way into Europe. But it ceased operations. We talked about this at the beginning of the year. So it ceased those operations in 2025, and it's been inoperable since then. And this is not the first time that Russian forces have utilized gas pipelines or any sort of subterranean sort of structure for their advances. They used this infamously, the veterans PMC units, last year during the course of the battle in Avdiivka. That was pretty much a year ago, maybe a bit more by this point in time. And in addition, we saw them use them to a smaller degree in Toretsk and in Chasiv Yar because there are pipelines going from north to south that carry water, not gas, in the Chasiv Yar region, for instance. And there are various subterranean facilities in the Toretsk industrial zone that the Russians also fought in throughout the course of that battle. But this is on a scale that rivals the situation in Avdiivka. It may actually be even deeper in terms of the penetration by the Russian side. It's being reported that Russian forces utilized a company-sized force to push through this pipeline, which has a diameter of 1.4 meters, so pretty small, but not extremely cramped. So you have to be like crutching over when you're doing it. And looking at the extent of the Russian advance, as you said before, it amounts to around 10 kilometers. Now, I'm not claiming that there is solid control for the Russian side all along this line in yellow. I just need to have some sort of continuous line to show you guys where the Russians advanced through along that pipeline. And now it's going to be a question of whether they're actually going to be able to establish a permanent connectivity between the areas they reached along this rail line going from north to south into Sudzha and the previous front line near Berdin and Biryukovka. That's a question that has not been settled yet, but I'm just showing you guys the routes. And the pipeline itself, I've marked here in black all the way to the pumping station near the border with Sumy over here. So you can see the course of that on the map, in addition to this logistics route that is also in black over here, which is one of the final roads that the Ukrainians still have in service at this point in time. So that's all there for your liking if you want to click on the map. But just in general, I want to say that earlier this morning, that's when the Russian forces, they mustered a force of around 100 men to infiltrate the front line they previously prepared by utilizing a large amount of fabs to strike Ukrainian positions near the entrance opening in order to clear it of any potential resistance. And we saw some footage of fabs being utilized, and we saw a ramp up in fabs, but they were attacking other locations like east of Malaya Luknaya. We saw some videos in Martinovka, for instance. We saw a video on March 8th of the Nona S 120 millimeter self-propelled howitzers shelling the Ukrainian drone crew, which isn't really related to the fighting going on a bit to the west, but nonetheless, that video was released over the past day. And so there definitely was preparation for this. And Ukrainian sources also mentioned that the rotations were targeted over this past week by the Russian Air Force. So the Su-34s were on heightened alert, and they were also using a new version of the UMPK kit that has a larger range. It allows the FAPs to obviously reach deeper into the Ukrainian lines. So that has all been introduced in recent days. So the Russians prepared for this and then actually conducted the operation. There are some photos of it that I'll attach in the thumbnail or in the description. The first person to break the story was the Ukrainian military journalist Yuri Butusov, and then it was reported on Ukrainian Pravda. and various other Ukrainian sources, where they mentioned that the Ukrainians this time had foreknowledge of the operation in contrast to what occurred last year in Avdiivka. And the unit that was involved in spotting it with reconnaissance drones and then repelling it was the 80th Air Assault Brigade. And they're actually the unit that released footage of the course of the battle that occurred today on their Telegram channel. So now we know for sure this occurred, and we have the exact location where the Russians were able to get out of the pipeline, and that's around here. So the Russians got out and they spread out into these two adjacent windbreaks, advancing southwards with the hope of establishing a permanent position in the northern parts of Sudzha, actually a bit to the northeast near Mirny, for instance. That's the location that the Russians tried dismounting at. Now, whether they actually entered in is not known at this point in time because all the footage is from the northern sections, the outskirts of Sudzha, and not actually in houses. So it seems that the Ukrainians were able to pin down a large quantity of those 100 men once they reached the exit point. And so the entrance point into the pipeline was targeted by the Ukrainians in order to prevent a Russian retreat through that same pipeline route. And then various squads that dispersed were targeted individually by Ukrainian artillery, including rocket artillery, and there were also DPICMs utilized, so cluster munitions. And this is just one of the geolocated regions that was mentioned, but then it extended as far south as this location that you see in yellow, meaning that the Russian forces are only about 300 to 400 meters away from the first houses of Sudzha that you can see on the map. The Ukrainians claim that due to the extended Russian positions, the fact that there wasn't a plan B for a case where the Ukrainians would just entirely surround these groupings, the fact that they were well prepared and concentrated firepower towards all these Russian forces, they claim that up to 80% of the Russian forces involved were killed. That's been a number that was spread widely over the past couple of hours by Ukrainian sources, although it's not unanimous. Not all sources are saying that on the Ukrainian side, and certainly not all Russian sources are saying that. Some Russian sources have talked about high casualties, and we're talking about a cohort of 100. So there is obviously a finitude to the amount of casualties that can be taken while the operation could still continue. But for the time being, all of the reports from both sides, from the Russian and Ukrainian side, are still in the present tense. So even though the Ukrainians are, of course, going to say that they are conducting stabilization measures and have been able to inflict high casualties on the Russian side, which I'm sure is true relative to the 100 soldiers that were involved and maybe some reinforcements that were moved in on foot through this sort of region, that really does imply that the fighting has not ended. There are continued clashes. So this is where the ambiguity comes in, and the only answer is that time will tell in this case, because it could either be that the Ukrainians have been able to encircle the remaining Russian groups that had not been killed during the initial ambush by the Ukrainian side, and then now they're just in the process of clearing those forces out. Or on the other hand, if you're subscribing more to the Russian favorable position, you could believe that the Russian forces have actually been able to solidly get control over these tree lines amidst the Ukrainian shelling, establish a solid base of connection with the Russian rear, and are now in the process of strengthening that and beginning to widen the, I suppose, salient that has been created. And now the Ukrainians are engaged in heavy counterattacks. So the truth is somewhere in between right now, and I can't say with absolute certainty either way. But all I will say is that it's certainly not the case that the Russians have taken over all of Sudzha, and it's certainly not the case that all of the Russian forces involved have been killed. There definitely are still elements that are involved and active in the fighting. And we'll have to see from the Russian side once they start posting photos from above ground, because they did post photos of their forces within the pipelines, but nothing so far from outside the pipelines near Sudzha. And this is understandably something that can play a role in exacerbating already difficult conditions for the Ukrainian side, because already there were concerns with Sudzha being the final bastion for Ukrainian resistance that could actually hold out for an extended period of time. So now having the Russian side cut off nearly the logistics route that connects to it from the south over here, constantly using the Rubicon drone unit to target dozens of Ukrainian vehicles coming in to supply Sudzha from the west along the R200 highway, and also destroying the bridge that connects the R200 to Sudzha itself. You could see that over here. The bridge was destroyed a couple of days ago. That's based on this geolocation over here that I added to the map. So that also complicated logistics. All of that plays a role in making it more difficult for the Ukrainians to use Sudzha as a permanent base to drag out fighting. And then we have this geolocation, not this one, but this one over here, of a column of 6 Ukrainian vehicles being targeted by the Russian side as they were rotating and organizing within the center of the city. meaning that now the Russian bombardment is becoming even more intense. So even with the Ukrainians potentially being able to use the structures over here as a resistance point from the air and through various means of firepower, the Russian forces are obviously getting closer and thereby moving their various means of firepower closer to the front line and thereby targeting Sudzha more directly, inflicting higher casualties and higher damage on the Ukrainian garrison over here. So the longevity of Sudzha is right now in extreme peril, not just from a frontline perspective, but in terms of attrition rates. So when we look at the frontline, for instance, if the Russians are able to continue and solidify control over here, maybe not now, but in the future, along the R200 highway, they would already be at the gates of Sudzha. They would already be able to enact direct pressure from the northern flank, and that would be coupled with the Russians already having a strong base of forces operating to the south of Sudzha at a pretty close distance, cutting off some of the access points to it from the southwest, and at the same time continuing to close in from the north directly in areas that the Ukrainians are trying to use as buffers to prevent the Russians from focusing all of their efforts on Sudzha. Because right now, this region that spanned, I suppose, 14, 15, 16 kilometers north of Sudzha is all a part of the purpose of distracting the Russians from the main goal of taking back Sudzha. That's why the Ukrainians are still even located in these places, although that could change very quickly due to the flanks of this outstretched pocket becoming extremely thin and extremely difficult to hold on to. So as we move past the pipeline situation, I do want to look at the Russian entrance into Cherkasskoye Perechnoye, which previously served as a Ukrainian organization point that they hoped would be the first linchpin in order to help them expand deeper into Russian territory. That never manifested, but it still acted as a Ukrainian frontline node. But now the Russians have been able to take it in addition to 18 square kilometers. And by the way, the Russians took around 13 square kilometers with the pipeline operation. And when we look at this advance, it includes a full capture of Berdin, Novocherkassky, Yamska Steppe. So a lot of these smaller hamlets that were in limbo situation, we now have full clarification that they're under Russian control. So in Perechnoye, it's possible that the entirety of the village has fallen into Russian hands. And then from there, it naturally follows. So the Russians will be able to advance along the same paved road southwards to Pravda, Ivashkovsky, and various other villages. I suppose the largest one in this location would be Kazakchaya, Loknaya, and that's probably the second largest Ukrainian organization point besides the entire Sudzha urban region. But when we look at the geolocation here, you can see the Russian forces as of March 8th raising their flag atop the church in Cherkasskoye Perechnoye, indicating an advance of a maximum of 6.5 kilometers by the Russian side. So it is a deep advance, a consolidation by the Russian side, coupled with the advance along the R200 highway and the pipeline. It leaves the Ukrainians sandwiched in between in an extremely compromised position, which could force them to withdraw if the Russian location in the pipeline area, if that salient is not closed down immediately, then the Ukrainians will actually be in imminent danger of being cut off themselves within this sort of 2 to 3 kilometer wide pocket that is formed in open fields and in gullies and such. So this area is also now become an area that's falling into Russian hands pretty quickly. When it comes to the spine of the Ukrainian Kursk region, as I refer to it, spanning from right now Staraya Sorochina all the way to Loknaya, the Russian forces are beginning to chip away at it, including the capture of these open fields and ravines amounting to 2.5 square kilometers of territory as the Russians begin to close in on Nikolaevka and on Malaya Luknaya. But so far, there's not an indication that they've been able to enter into those villages themselves yet. Although the situation is changing now because there are apparently troop rotations. You're seeing the movement of higher quality Ukrainian units like the 95th Air Assault Brigade away from the front line. So 95th Brigade, they played a critical role in holding on to the front line along these villages for numerous months now throughout the winter. Now they're being replaced by territorial defense units, and they could include elements like the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade, and there are a couple of other ones that theoretically could be deployed based on this reporting. And Ukrainian sources are mentioning this, that a lot of the sort of vanguard units that are being deployed are of a lower caliber, and they are from the territorial defense elements. So older, usually less trained, worse equipment, and less cohesion, command sort of experience and structure. So now the higher quality units that have been involved in all of the high intensity fighting throughout the past couple of months that allowed the Ukrainians to retain control over these villages in the first place, they're being moved out with heavy equipment and they're driving in the direction of Sudzha. So it would look something like this in terms of their escape route into Sudzha. So they're at the very least not withdrawing from the entirety of Sumy or Kursk, I should say, just yet, based on this reporting. But they are moving away from the front line, and they're hoping to retain control over Sudzha as a sort of last bastion to drag out the fighting. That's sort of the gist that I'm getting from a lot of this reporting. And even if that's not the case, even if they do try to hold on, they won't be able to for a long time due to the Russian momentum and due to how difficult it is to retain control over this, I suppose, 8 kilometer wide pocket that is extremely exposed from the east because it's just consisting of open fields, no defenses, barely any Ukrainian units. And then from the west, it's just a couple of populated areas that have consistently fallen into Russian control over the past couple of days, as is evidenced by Novaya Sorochina and Staraya Sorochina. So the Russian momentum over here really shows no signs of stopping, meaning that the Ukrainians have an opportunity to withdraw with most of their forces intact over here before they get into an operational encirclement, before they're squeezed out in a way that leads to higher attrition rates. So that's something that the Ukrainians should be considering really seriously right now. And then to move a bit to the southwest, we also see the Russian forces continuing to expand into Sumy Oblast, this time capturing 6.75 square kilometers of territory. Here you can see the Alcor FPV unit. They struck Russian forces that crossed the border and entered into Novenke, this hamlet that's pretty close to the border. And that was on March 8th, as you can see with the geolocation. FPV strikes also show how much damage there is to the entire region and to the nearby houses. And it also indicates that the Russian forces are in the process of moving southwards towards Basivka. They may be able to solidify control over outposts across the border. And now, of course, naturally, the next objective will be to shift their focus 2 kilometers to the southeast and take over that larger settlement near the border. And that will give them the momentum and the position needed to then actually achieve deeper penetrations into Sumy through open fields, through local roads to reach some of the more important rear bases like Loknaya and Yunikivka. And right now, if we're looking at the width of the Kursk pocket in its entirety between these two outstretched Russian advances, it's less than 12 kilometers. So the walls really are closing in on the Ukrainian side, and they won't have a choice to withdraw or else they'll be forced out of some of these regions. And so, for the purpose of really retaining manpower, the Ukrainians really should be considering either a full scale withdrawal from the entirety of Kursk or withdrawals from the outstretched pockets right now at this moment. And then they probably will look to drag out the fighting in Sudzha for as long as possible in order to keep Russian forces tied down over here that, of course, are larger in size than the Ukrainian garrison. They don't want them to be redeployed elsewhere. They also don't want the Russians to have the standing needed to then enter into Sumy itself and continue with offensive activities over there. So there are a lot of moving parts with this equation. When it comes to the Ukrainian size, it's been reported by Ukrainian sources that there are 10,000 men within Kursk itself, and you're looking at probably 380 square kilometers of territory under Ukrainian control in Kursk right now, as can be seen on my map. So they're claiming it's about 10,000. And that's realistic at this point because obviously the size of the Kursk pocket is beginning to get smaller and smaller. And so then it's less safe to have rear bases or lodges for soldiers in those locations. And I would assume the majority are located in Sudzha, in basements, and probably in the western portions that are closer to the border with Russia or Ukraine, rather. So the rest of the garrison, because that's not the entire Ukrainian garrison that is moving in and out of Kursk on a daily basis, it's probably much larger. So based on the deployment of Ukrainian soldiers and units that have been able to track and keep up to date, there were a couple of different fronts that I would designate. So one of them is the Sumy front, which is located over here to the west of the Kursk pockets. And this is really Ukrainian objective over here is to just prevent deep Russian breakthroughs into Sumy territory, into open fields over here, into the rear roads that connect to Kursk itself. And so you can see some of the units involved with that include drone units, they include border detachments, they include the 144th Mechanized Brigade, 67th Mechanized Brigade, and then a couple of other units like 21st Brigade. So in total, those three mechanized units are involved with the fighting. You also have elements that are currently engaged with Russian forces that are crossing over the border, like the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, 126th Brigade, and a lot of them are territorial defense units, as we mentioned, because they're the ones that are now beginning to fill up the ranks as rotations begin to become increasingly common. There are a couple of drone units also involved that are operating a couple of kilometers away from the front line, trying to strike individual Russian soldiers and vehicles. When it comes to the other part of the front line that I sort of designate on its own, it spans about 16 or 17 kilometers and it's the entire western edge of the pockets. So this would include 36th Brigade, 73rd Center for Special Operations, naval units, 95th Air Assault Brigade, and then 17th Heavy Mechanized units, 22nd Mechanized Brigade, and then a couple of other high caliber units that may or may not be rotated at this very point in time. But up until now, they've definitely been fighting over here, like 47th Brigade. You also have the 210th Assault Regiment in Berlingo. They were previously operating around Chassis VR, but they were recently deployed to here to get involved with the high intensity fighting. And then the 4th and 6th Special Purpose Regiments of the Ranger Corps are also fighting around here and played a big role in preventing Russian breakthroughs on the southern southwestern rear of this entire pocket that I'm sort of highlighting in the circle over here. So they're also important for the fighting. Then you have the eastern part of the front line, which supports to protect the northeastern entrance into Sudzha. This includes the 80th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, 92nd Assault Brigade as well. And you have the 8th Special Purpose Regiment, 1st Tank Brigades around here. Then you have the entire Sudzha garrison, I would say, which includes units that are just sort of stationed in Sudzha, and their role is to ensure that the Russians can't enter into it directly. So there are a couple of battalions over here. 61st Mechanized Brigade is also involved. You have the 116th TDF Brigade, but they may now be moved elsewhere closer to the front line to act as vanguards. This is also where you have the 41st Brigade and a couple of other units that are now involved trying to push the Russians out of their outstretched pocket that is very close to the border with Russia and Ukraine, and also the road into Sudzha. So that is all a part of the Ukrainian garrison. A couple of smaller units like the Sheikh Mansour Battalion are over here, and of course some battalions that are independently operating. Then to the south, you have the Guevo element, which is the smallest and it's the most detached from the rest of the Kursk region, but it's located south of the current Russian pocket that has been able to expand recently and includes the 129th, 106th, and Territorial Defense Brigades, rather, and the 22nd Special Purpose Battalion of the Presidential Brigade. So hopefully that was useful and gives you an idea of the size of the Ukrainian force over here. Because when you do the math and you see there's 19 brigades, you have like 3 battalions and 4 regiments. It roughly adds up to 40,000 to 45,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And so it wouldn't make sense if 10,000 are fighting in the pocket and then there are 30,000 on the rear moving in and out on a daily basis. But movement has become so difficult recently because of the Russian Rubicon units. It's a unit that was created in mid 2024 and has recently improved, and it's become a massive nexus for Russian drone training and praxis. And so by mid January, they became a stable in the Russian entire Kursk offensive, basically. And they've just been raining hell upon the roads that lead into Sudzha and Kursk generally, destroying dozens of Ukrainian vehicles along individual spans of roads. They swarm individual columns of Ukrainian vehicles and target them within very specific pointed regions. They target them on the like backs and the tops of the tanks or the armored vehicles, and also under the vehicles, acting sort of like mine charges from under the vehicles, leading to a lot of significant damage. They have advanced spoofing abilities and are able to bypass electronic warfare systems while being traditional FPV drones, meaning they don't have the cumbersome limitations of, say, a fiber optic FPV, but they still are able to, resist the jamming by the Ukrainian side that has been able to take down a lot of other drone elements. That is sort of the benefit of fiber optic. So they've been able to get the fiber optic benefits while taking out a lot of the downsides. And that's played a role in increasing the amount of attrition for Ukrainian equipment in this region. So that's all for the Kursk region. I just want to very quickly look at a couple of other areas of the front line. So in Touretsk over here, you can see there is movement. The Ukrainians have been able to make some marginal gains. First of all, we have additional proof indicating that the Ukrainians do remain in this outstretched pocket south of Krimske, amounting to 15 hectares. And there's a new geolocation from the Russian side showing them striking a department in central Toretsk. So this is important because it's the first time that the Ukrainians have been able to enter into the citadel of central Toretsk, and now the Russians are beginning to strike it because they understand the significance of the Ukrainians getting holed up in there. It becomes much more difficult to dislodge them than, say, attacking them in single residential or single story buildings. Also, you see over here south of Zabalka, or just in the northwestern part of Zabalka, you see that there are further advances by the Ukrainian side, amounting to a total advance of what is this 1,000 meters rather, getting pretty close to actually the center of the Zabalka district. So the Ukrainians have been able to make some progress over here since the past over the past couple of days, I should say. And on March 8th, this video was released of the Russian side dropping grenades onto houses in central Zabalka. You could see the utter destruction in the micro district, but nonetheless, the I suppose skeletons of a lot of the houses are still intact, meaning that they're good places to hide in, and then the basements have not been destroyed. So they're good operating posts for advancing Ukrainian small squads. So that is also a part of today's updates. And just finally, I want to zoom in on the situation in or on the Dnipro front, Dnipro axis. You can see a slight advance by the Russians less than 2 square kilometers south of Zaporizhia. And on March 8th, the video is released from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which has recently moved to this part of the front line after just a long period of time where it was not necessarily given an important combat role, because definitely it needed that rest and rotation after months of being involved in some of the most intense fighting all across the front line in the Donbass region. So now it's been deployed to an area that is of high intensity, but not as high as some of the other regions like Pokrovsk or Kursk. And it's being given the role of the 151st Mechanized Brigade, but that unit was moved to the Outskirts bridgehead. So now the 72nd Brigade will replace it. So they just conducted FPV strikes onto Russian vehicles and infantry south of Zaporizhia that were advancing through these open fields, as you can see on the map. And they're also joined by the 225th Special Assault Regiment, which previously operated in Kursk but was moved over the past couple of months to this region. And so they're also involved with generally the Dnipro axis and repelling some of the Russian attacks that are occurring to the west of Pokrovsk. So that's important to keep in mind from the order of battle perspective. And then to finish off, we have over here the situation in Constantinople, because Russian sources claim that they've been able to advance into the northeastern parts of the town and take it over, and are in the process of encircling and squeezing out Ukrainian remnants from the western portions. But there's not any physical proof of it. There's not really proof from a lot of Russian sources that have credible maps, or even from the Ukrainian side, or even any videos. There's only one video that's been released and geolocated to this region in recent days, and it's from March 8th. It's of a Ukrainian armored vehicle getting hit by a mine during a troop rotation in the western part of the town. So the fact that vehicles are still involved in troop rotations over here gives us a clear indication that the Ukrainian forces are present, albeit they are under increased strain by the Russian side, and Russian infantry are very close. This indicates that there is still work to be done from the Russian perspective, and that they have not fully taken over the town. They have to still clear out this western portion that is a hotbed for Ukrainian vestiges, and then also the north that has not even been touched yet. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.